and state taxes. Over the last 8 years, the state's share has increased. When Governor Rounds and I took office, the state was paying about 52% on a statewide basis of that collective total. Today it pays about 57% of that collective total. Now the question is about opt-outs. There are some folks in South Dakota who say opt-outs and the prevalence of them is an indication that that system doesn't work. And I disagree with that notion. What it tells you is that in the school district where you had an opt-out, that school district has chosen to spend more per student than the 4804, as opposed to another district who has chosen not to spend more. It gives local control to the school district. And there are many, many states that have a local option tax increase program just like South Dakota's opt-out program. To not have an opt-out program would require the state to impose a tax increase on the entire population and then distribute that money to all school districts without regard to whether the people in this district want it or that district don't. This gives local taxpayers control over whether they want to increase the funding to their school beyond the limitation that's otherwise available under the formula system.
Was that an answer?
Scott Heidepin, same question with regard to how will you ease the tax burden on landowners with regard to the opt-outs that go to school districts?
Dennis, in a previous answer, said that the people holding the white signs have his name, Dennis. He's not Mike Rounds, he's Dennis Stugard. But you notice how he wraps himself in the Rounds administration whenever it's something that he wants to agree with, and then runs from them when it's something he doesn't want anything to do with. Well, the truth of the matter is, he just didn't answer the question. He didn't answer what's going to happen with property taxes. It's going to be a continuation of what we have as it relates to education. Here's what's going on. The share of education in the state budget went from 39% when they took office to 31% today. Okay? That's what's happening to education. They are presiding over the dismantling of public education in South Dakota. 39% of the budget 8 years ago, 31% of the budget now. Any increases have been through clenched teeth and over their heads by the legislature, which seemed to be quite passionate, at least in the Senate when it came to education. Now, here's the other thing to understand. There are three sources of funding for schools for the children in South Dakota. One is the federal government, and South Dakota does real well in terms of federal dollars. The second is you, the property taxpayer, and your property taxes are high. The reason they're high is because the state's share, the third leg of the stool, is woefully inadequate and has been going down for the last 8 years. 39% 8 years ago, 31% today. South Dakota, at the state level, sends fewer dollars back for the students than any state in the nation. That is a record that's inexcusable, that has to change. Now, the Lieutenant Governor likes to point out that I'm in favor of spending more for education. Guilty as charged. But what I tell him is those dollars come from somewhere, and it's not an increase in taxes. It's a change in state government, a very fundamental change. We're going into the next year with a $107 million budget deficit brought to us by this administration. That's 9% of the entire revenue stream for South Dakota, which means that 9% of all the money we bring in will just go to pay the deficit that they've created. That's what happens when you grow state government. That's what happens when the general fund goes up at 5.5%. And as far as teachers and the other things that are important that he talks about, they sure are. That's why we have to reduce the size of state government elsewhere.
Mr. Newgard, 2 minutes to rebuttal.
Well, again, my opponent needs a new calculator. The budget deficit next year, the projected deficit, the number he uses is almost a year old. It came up last December. He continues to use it in spite of changes that have been implemented in the law. It's probably more close to $85 million. Now, why do we have a deficit? Why do we have a deficit? We have a deficit for the same reason that all other states but a few have it, because the national recession has caused tax revenue to fall, and it has caused Medicaid claims to skyrocket. Medicaid claims in South Dakota now consume 1/4 of the whole budget. Medicaid claims are up 68% since Governor Rounds and I took office. The entire rest of the budget has gone up about 3.6% per year. Now, 18.7 of that is entirely attributable to inflation. 6.6 of it could be population growth. So to suggest that the budget has ballooned out of control in the last 8 years is baloney. Now, he also talked about the smaller percentage spent on education. Well, of course there's a smaller percentage if Medicaid balloons and the entire budget grows, but Medicaid becomes a larger percentage of that larger pie. But I remind you again, in numbers of dollars, don't play with percentage misdirection. In numbers of dollars, 8 years ago, the state was spending $313 million on education. Now, $399 million, $86 million more for 3,000 fewer students.
2 minutes for your rebuttal, Mr. Heideprin.
Thank you. Dennis says that we should look at the actual dollar amounts and not the percentage. How else are we going to figure out what the priorities of state government are unless we see a pie chart and we know what size the piece of the pie is for education or for anything else that we do in state government? That's exactly how we decide those things. And for him to suggest that this budget deficit is a function of the economy is completely untrue. For 7 of the 8 years they've been in office, they have submitted budgets with structural deficits to the legislature in South Dakota. They don't know how to balance a budget. They can't balance a budget without a structural deficit in it. In fact, the governor's own veto of House Bill 1060, the wind energy bill, talks about the structural deficit and the problem that we have in South Dakota with it. We just can't control spending at the state level, and that's what we need to do. We need to have a fiscal conservative come in, change the priorities of the state, make education. If you read the Constitution in this state, you know the founders of South Dakota were obsessed with education, and they were obsessed with infrastructure. It was roads and bridges and kids. That's what they wanted us to invest in. But instead, in South Dakota, our record of investing in education is a dismal failure over the last 8 years. I will tell you this. If you go out to Pierre during the legislative session, that building can be divided in half. Half of the folks think of spending on kids as a cost, and half of us think of it as an investment. You know which side I'm on.
I hold in my hand the last question. I am sorry that we did not get to all of them. We had a lot of questions submitted, and they are all good questions, and we've done, in the last 90 minutes, both of our candidates have done a good job of getting through just about all of them. So this last question, and it will go to you first, Scott Heideprin, from someone in the audience who says, I have 5 friends who recently graduated from college and are having trouble finding jobs or finding jobs in their field. With $50,000 in student loans, they regret the decision to go to college. Now, it might be, it's either 50 or 80. Can't read your handwriting, but you know who you are. With somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 in student loans, they regret the decision to go to college. What will you do to help students in our state with college costs and job placement? What will you do to help graduates in our state and local communities?
Thank you for the question. I look over here and I see Bernie Hunhoff, who is the author of a bill that would have done something about this in the last legislative session. South Dakota is the last state in the nation with no needs-based scholarship program at the state level. Let me say that again. We're the last state in the nation with no needs-based scholarship program at the state level. Bernie introduced a bill that would have created it. It was vetoed by the governor of South Dakota. You know, it's time South Dakota took a much more sophisticated approach when it comes to kids and college and costs. We cannot continue to increase the cost of tuition and fees at the state level and then just expect kids to absorb those costs without anything else happening. We have to play a role, and I think a needs-based scholarship would have been a very important first step, and I commend Leader Hunhoff and the members of the legislature who did decide to support that. I find it so regrettable that the governor used his veto on a measure like that. Beyond that, we need economic development to create new jobs. That doesn't mean economic development of the state bureaucracy. The bureaucracy